how exactly you go through. Okay, let me make sure we're at the start. Get Zoom back up. Okay, you should be able to see slides now. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to be doing an overview of the HathiTrust Research Center, which is a group which builds tools and services for text and data mining of the HathiTrust corpus. You have access to these slides via the box link that's on the slide now, so I'll leave this up for a second if you want to grab it. Okay, looks like people are mostly done typing it in. Yeah, okay. All right, so here's what I'm going to be covering today. I'll do a bit of an introduction, and then I'm going to run through 4 conceptual areas or thematic areas related to the Research Center. And then for each, we'll talk about a specific tool or service that relates to that concept. So we'll talk about the data that underlies these services in the HathiTrust plus Bookworm tool. We'll talk about building work sets and the HTRC algorithms. We'll talk about methods for text analysis that are available through the Research Center, and then the HTRC extracted features data set. And then at the end, we'll talk about this concept of non-consumptive research and the HTRC data capsules. So I wanted to start with a research example to give you an idea of the kind of work that some researchers have done using data from HathiTrust. So this project is called The Transformation of Gender in English Language Fiction. And it was a research project carried out by Ted Underwood and Sabrina Lee at the University of Illinois, and David Bamman, who's a researcher at Berkeley. And so they worked on a project that used natural language processing methods and also HTRC extracted features data, which you'll know more about as we go through the presentation today, to study the way that women had been depicted in English language fiction over time. So they were interested in seeing the kind of language that was used around female characters, and then also did a little bit of work into gender and authorship. And what they found is that the depictions of men and women become less distinct over time. And that's part of what the graph on this slide is showing, whereas the variance towards the earlier time in the period they were studying, where you see the dots scattered from top to bottom, you see that line getting more coalesced by the 2000s. But they also found that the overall number of female characters and female authors declined by half in literature from 1850 to 1950, which is a bit of a surprise, I think, for the authors. And in their paper, they talk about why they think that might be the case, and also dig really deeply into their methods and the kind of analysis tools that they used. But this is just one example of the kind of research project that can be conducted using Research Center data and tools. Most of you are likely relatively familiar with HathiTrust, but in case not, HathiTrust is all of these things. It's a large-scale digitization initiative, so it's bringing in digital content from member libraries. It's a trusted digital repository, so trust and storage and long-term preservation of the materials is of utmost importance to HathiTrust. It's also a digital library with a user-facing endpoint where you can search and read books that are in the public domain. And then it's also a partnership of member institutions, and obviously UC Merced is one of those partners, and there are over 140 partner institutions, primarily in the United States, with some international partners in Canada and the UK, Australia, New Zealand, etc. The HathiTrust collection is nearing 17 million total volumes of digitized content. That represents 6.4 million volumes in the public domain, roughly 8.2 million book titles, a little over 400,000 serial titles. Of course, for one title, there is likely to be more than one publication, sometimes duplicates or sometimes, runs of edition from a single serial title. And all of this represents 760 terabytes of data. The collection is also growing, and it's growing, I think, maybe not quite at a rate of 1 million volumes per year, but to give you an idea, when I started my job 4 years ago, the collection had about 13.7 million volumes in it. So it is growing at a steady but relatively rapid rate. Around 50% of materials in the collection are in English. They span from the 15th through the 21st century, although the amount of content from the 15th, 16th, 17th century is much, much smaller, and the majority of materials are from the 20th century. Around 63% of the materials are in copyright or of unknown status, and we'll talk about why that's important as we go through the presentation today. The collection represents a range of genres. So fiction, a lot of the work that's been done so far is based in literary history, but it doesn't have to be that way. There's quite a bit of history, scientific texts, a lot of government documents that are really rich resources for all kinds of materials, and then more. All of these items are contributed by member institutions. So HathiTrust doesn't do any digitizing itself, and it also doesn't maintain a physical book library itself. All of these materials are coming in from those partners. In terms of access to the digital library itself, anybody, anywhere can read public domain and open access works. They can search across the full text of any item in the repository, including the in-copyright content. They can also receive a data set of public domain content. Members, though, in particular, can download public domain and open access works. They can provide access to their users who are blind or who have print disabilities, and also access replacement copies for lost or damaged print copies. So when you have a corpus this large, nearing 17 million volumes, there are lots of opportunities that present themselves for digital scholarly research. Some of the questions that have to be considered are, how do you leverage the scale and scope of the digital library for data-intensive research? And how do you facilitate data mining on a collection with significant copyright limitations? And these are the questions that the HathiTrust Research Center is interested in investigating. So the Research Center enables computational analysis of the HathiTrust corpus, and it's engaged in research and development. So that means that sometimes we're doing exploratory work to test different ways of crunching and providing access to the data. And it also means that we're building production level tools and services for researchers who are doing text and data mining research. The center has no physical location. It's a virtual center, and it's split between Indiana University and the University of Illinois, with support from HathiTrust via the University of Michigan. The HTRC has a multi-pronged approach for how it supports text and data mining. So we acknowledge that there's no one-size-fits-all tool. We've done user studies, we've talked to researchers, and we know that most projects are coming at their work with a relatively either highly specific to that project or a sense that the work that they're doing is highly individualized. And so we don't want to build tools or services that are too specific to one area of research or one kind of research method. So we offer solutions to meet a range of skills and needs with an attempt to accommodate a variety of text analysis methods. And we'll be looking at what these tools and services are as we go forward. But we do acknowledge that there are some gaps. So there are some people who may not be able to do exactly what they hope they would be able to do within the suite of services that we offer. So the framework for the tools that the HTRC provides, you can sort of think about it like this triangle. I won't belabor this too much, but we're going to be looking at tools and data services that fall within each of these points on the triangle. So there are ways of getting access to Research Center materials that provide a partial approach to text and data mining services, where the access to the data is limited, but the outputs and the access to the tools is completely open. We'll be looking at a transformative model where the data is transformed before it's provided to researchers, and the output and the access are still open. And then also this capsule model, where the data itself is less restricted in the way that it is presented, but the output of the researcher's work and access to the tools and the data is highly controlled. Most of the HTRC services can be accessed through the analytics website, and the URL for that is analytics.hathitrust.org. And this is where you get access to tools. It's where you can find links for downloading some of those open data sets. And you need to have an account to be able to log in. And you'll have to use your university email address. It's not the same login as you use for HathiTrust. That's one limitation that's just inherent in the system. So you'll have to create an account, and you won't be able to use like a Google account or a Yahoo account. You'll have to use your UC Merced email address. All right, so let's jump in and talk about the data. So the materials that are in HathiTrust are scanned from book-like materials. So that means that while there are some, say, newspapers in the repository, they are, scant. And my sense is that newspapers are mostly student newspapers that were probably bound together and digitized. But most of the things that are in the digital library are something that you could have pulled off the shelf and scanned and then added to the repository. The image formats for the materials that are there are TIFF and JPEG 2000. The OCR is generated automatically, and that's done prior to ingest. And that means that HathiTrust and the Research Center aren't doing any cleanup of the OCR that's coming in. So it's dirty, it's uncorrected, and it's done sort of in the pre-ingest phase by the contributing institution. PDFs are also generated on demand, so there's not a repository of PDFs sitting somewhere that someone could have access to without them being created for a specific use case. The way that the materials in the digital library described is really specific to the library world. So there's a MARC bibliographic metadata that's submitted by each of the libraries that holds the original item from which the digitized version, where it came from. And then that metadata is augmented by HathiTrust with some additional fields, but we don't do any cleanup of the records. And so that means that sometimes you'll find artifacts and some idiosyncratic cataloging practices. And then it also means that researchers who are interested in engaging with HathiTrust or with the Research Center need often to learn just a little bit about the way that library materials are described in order to understand the metadata that will help them get access to the materials that they want. The metadata is shared in limited formats via the Hathi files and the bibliographic API. So HathiTrust maintains its own data store, as does HTRC. So the data is moved from HathiTrust to the HTRC's own data storage system. And only OCR, text data, and metadata are moved. So HTRC doesn't retain a copy of page images. So occasionally we have researchers who want to use our tools to analyze page images. And that we haven't provided access to researchers to be able to do that in a general way. That is something, and even HathiTrust, has different access provisions for the page images. So that's just something to keep in mind, that we're really interested in text data mining. The data is synced from HathiTrust nightly, so there's not really a lag time between the two repositories, but there is a chance that something has made it into the digital library, and then there's a little bit of a lag before it's available via the Research Center's tools. And then the Research Center presents, processes, and makes available this data in a few different forms. So one that I want to mention off the top is the HathiTrust plus Bookworm Tool, which is a visualization platform to graph word trends in the repository over time. So I am going to open Bookworm, and I'll show you what it looks like. Okay, so you should be seeing a browser window now. So this is the Bookworm tool, and it allows you to search for unigrams, so single words, across the entire corpus from 1760 through the, through now, but there's sort of a cliff actually of what's been digitized and uploaded. But anyway, through the present day. So one search term that often is just a general one that shows up when you do your search is computer. So this is just a default example. One thing that's nice about the Bookworm tool versus something like Google Ngram Viewer is that you're able to facet your search based on the library metadata. So I am going to facet based on class. So originally it had been, the example was showing language and literature, but I'm going to do in all classes. And then I can also add a second search term to say do a comparative search. And so I could limit this to technology, say that might be sort of interesting. And then I can hit search. And I will see the trend usage of those terms over time. It just might take a second. So this is not altogether unsurprising. You're seeing this flat line, and then you're seeing this big jump. The orange is showing in works that were classified as technology, and the blue is showing in across the entire collection. This is showing words per million, so it is accounting for the fact that more things were published later in time versus earlier in time, and also that there are more materials in the repository from the latter day than there are in these earlier years. And then if I click anywhere on my line, it might take a second to pop up, I can get a list of all of the items where that term occurred. So then you can dig back into the text if you want to. If you happen to be linking out to something that's not in the public domain, then it takes you to a screen that just shows that the item is in limited view. Okay, so the faceting terms here give you an idea of the kinds of metadata that are available through the repository, which is primarily that marked metadata. So things about, you know, where it was published, the classification. So Bookworm can be a good place to start to just get an idea of the data and the metadata that exists for the Research Center. So let me switch back over to slides. So here's an example of how someone used Bookworm. Samuel Franklin was a researcher, a graduate student at Brown when he was working with HTRC on a project. And he did this really interesting work into the usage of the terms creative and creativity over time. But it was a graph like this that really got him started on his work, where he knew that there was this drastic upswing in usage of the terms creative, starting at about 1915, it looks like. And so he wanted to investigate that more. So Bookworm represents a jumping off point for a project where then he was able to dig more deeply into the data. All right, so let's talk now about building work sets. So a work set is an HTRC specific term. So if you go out anywhere else and you talk about building a work set, people really won't know what you're talking about, but it's a useful way of describing how HTRC provides access to some of its textual content. So a work set is just a data set of HathiTrust volumes for analysis in HTRC. At its core, it's a manifest of volume information. And so that means that if you have a manifest or a list of those URLs that follow a volume from place to place within our ecosystem, then it can correspond to a collection that you build, and the HathiTrust Digital Library can also correspond to a data set that you might request from HathiTrust, and then it also correlates to pointers that you would analyze with the all that are available via HTRC. So these are transferable across systems. And what's interesting about them, or unique as compared to a data set, is that they don't include the text data by default. Whereas a data set, you think about downloading a data set, you're actually getting the data. If you download a work set, what you're getting is the metadata, because it's just those pointers to the text content to which you're going to apply the tool that you want to use. They're also citable and shareable, so you could say, they have a name, they're associated with an author, and so that provides opportunities for reproducibility, or at least following on others' work. There's two primary ways to create a work set, and this is in the analytics site. The first is to upload a file of volume IDs. Remember, we're just talking about a manifest. So in this option, a researcher would curate a list of HathiTrust volumes, volume identifiers in a text file. So maybe they have created, anyway, so sorry, I won't get too far afield here because I want to be mindful of time. this is for the researcher who just, is ready to dig into the metadata and do some programmatic work of their own, or else they're building on work someone else has already done. For whatever reason, they have a list of known IDs. The other option is to first create a collection in the HathiTrust Digital Library Collection Builder, which is part of the digital library website where you can search, read, and then also build these collections of materials. And if you do that, you create a collection, and then you can click a button in the analytics site to import from HathiTrust. And that will move over the volume information and some of the metadata from the collection that you had created. If you want to analyze a work set, one of the primary ways that you do that is by using the algorithms that live in HTRC analytics. So these are off-the-shelf algorithms. They provide means to analyze HathiTrust digital library content. So you can't do comparative work between digital library content and another source using these algorithms. If you wanted to do that, you would need to explore other options. And the researcher sees only their work set and the results. So this is this idea of the partial access. So here is one visualization of an output from the topic modeling tool. So here we're seeing topics from this analysis visualized as these bubbles. And a researcher can dig in and look at the different topics that were visualized from their corpus. There's also a tool that will do named entity extraction, which coming to NER, you might think, how complicated is it for a computer to recognize places of organizations and people and dates? There is, a bit of computation that happens here. It's more than just regular expressions. We're looking for capital letters. This is, a tool that we're borrowing from the Stanford suite of tools, but this can be useful if someone wants to do a quick analysis to pick up the name of people, the name of organizations that exist within their work set. So here's an example of how someone used one of these algorithms. This is showing an older version of the topic modeling tool. So the visualization that came out of that one was slightly different. It was these word clouds. But Joya Stevens is a librarian in New York, and she wanted to do a project for a thesis where she was exploring the algorithms within HTRC, just to, as a librarian, get experience with them for her own local practice. But she applied it to a research question she had about cookbooks, early American cookbooks. And so she created these topics of concepts that were existing in those cookbooks. It's an interesting application. You can see the way that some of the topics really make sense. Maybe some of them make less sense, which is all a part of the process of creating and analyzing a topic that comes out of a topic model. Okay, so I started alluding to this earlier, so now let's just dig in for a second. The primary pathway that we have set up for creating a work set is to build the collection in the HathiTrust Digital Library and then click the button to import it over. There are researchers either who have a research question that isn't conducive to that kind of work, or for whom that process of searching a digital library interface and clicking to select and then clicking to build just doesn't work with their preferred workflows. They would like to do things programmatically. For those researchers, we have a few options. One is to use the Hathi files or the bibliographic API that I mentioned to access the metadata and do some search and curation on their own. They can also use an existing list. For example, there's a data set called Word Frequencies in English Language Literature that came out of a project that the HathiTrust Research Center was involved in or supported. And that researcher pulled together lists of volume IDs for fiction, nonfiction prose, and poetry in the digital library. So that can be a great place to start. Or a researcher can always ask for help. So if they're having trouble creating a list of volumes that you want to analyze, we encourage people to contact us, and that is a service that we provide, is either offering advice on how to go about the search process or to how to approach the problem that they have. And then also sometimes we can do a little bit of back-end magic to pull together a volume list for people. Okay, so let's talk about research methods now. So oftentimes people ask about the kinds of methods they can use with HTRC, and there's a range. So I have on the slide a table that goes through each of the tools, the technical skills that would be required to engage with that tool, the data format that is used in the tool, and then also the corresponding method. So for example, the bookworm and the algorithms that we've looked at, those require a relatively low technical skill level. There might be some knowledge needed to engage with the vocabulary that's used on the site or to understand the text analytic process, but it's really, a point and click sort of tool. Both of these tools provide access only to the results, and they can do things like visualize trends or do the topic modeling or the named entity extraction. Those off-the-shelf options for researchers who are just getting started, or for students, or who want a chance to do a little bit of exploratory work. Then there's the HTRC extracted features dataset, which we'll talk about in a lot more detail in this section, in the data capsules environment. Both of these tools require medium to high skill levels to engage with them. So they assume that the researcher who is using them has, the data skills to access the data set, so use an API or access materials via a command line tool like rsync, the ability to analyze the data on their own, maybe the ability to do a little programming or to prepare data in the way that it can be fed into an existing tool that they would like to use. The difference between the extracted features dataset and the data capsules environment is that the extracted features dataset offers word and word counts for volumes in the digital library in a very structured file. And it can only be used with methods that require a bag of words, which is just this idea that what words existed in the text and how many times they occurred, but you don't know the order in which they occurred. The data capsules environment offers raw OCR to researchers and the ability to use almost any data mining technique, but there are limitations on who can have access to a capsule and what you can take out of one. All right, so let's dig a little bit more into the extracted features dataset. This is an example of the transformative model where the HTRC has crunched data in advance for the researcher, and this allows us to provide freer access to the materials, but in a limited format. So the extracted features dataset is a derived dataset, which means that, like I said, we have done some crunching of the data in advance for the researcher. And it represents page and volume level data where there is one JSON file, one JSON extracted features file for each volume in the digital library. Now it represents a snapshot of the digital library when it was at about 15.7 million volumes. So there is a gap. You're in the process of recrunching the data right now. But the data set exists and lives somewhere. The files aren't generated on the fly. And they're downloadable using a command line tool called rsync. You just have to know where the files live. So you need a URL path to get to the file. And there's instructions for how to go from volume ID to that URL that you need to do the download. This might be very small on your screen, but that's okay. It hopefully gives you an idea of what the structured content looks like. So for some people coming to the extracted features files, it can be a little bit disorienting because you're thinking about text data, you're probably thinking about free text data that's unformatted, but these JSON files are highly formatted. And they include information about the volume, so bibliographic information, like, what year was it published in, or what was the imprint, which often correlates to the author, what was the title of the volume. And then it gives you information about the pages that's derived computationally in the process of making the files. So that's things like how many lines were on the page, how many empty lines, characterizing the beginnings and the ends of lines. That can give you an idea of whether something looks like perhaps it's an index or a table of contents if every line ends in a number, say. But then the meat of the files is the token and token count information. So token is just another way of saying word here. So they're single word tokens. And the data set will tell you what the word is on each page its part of speech, and then how many times it occurred. So for some researchers, this information is enough to do a research project. They don't care about the word order. It's not important to them, the original context of the words on the page. They just need to know that the word did occur. And then by providing some of this additional metadata about the pages, about part of speech tagging in particular, this sets the researcher up to move on to the next stage in their research. Because often this process of doing the tokenization and part of speech tagging is the first step that a researcher would take anyway. And so we think that it's mutually beneficial. We get to provide access to the data, including data derived from those in copyright volumes, freely to the public without having to log in or do anything to do a special request process. But then we're also setting the researcher up to create the same steps of a project. So I have an example of the way that someone has used the extracted features dataset. So this isn't a text analysis research example, but it is a tool example that I find sort of fun. So David Mimno is a researcher at Cornell, and he built a little tool where you can search for a term, and then you can see what words occurred near that word. So just within a per page context, not like one right after the other, but near one another within a page over time. So this screenshot is showing searching for Washington. So you can see that from 1912 to 1923, the words around Washington tend to have to do with cities, but then you can also see that there's things like president and address. And I think as you go back in time, they become more associated with the president, if I'm remembering correctly, whereas the further out in time you go, they become more and more associated with the city. So this is an example, too, of how someone has taken this freely available data set and built something else that other people can have access to. In order to best utilize the extracted features data set, there is a Python library that the Research Center maintains called the Feature Reader. And it's specifically working for working with the extracted features data set. This library makes it easier to download the files, so it includes some inbuilt functionality to make it easier to go from volume ID to that path, the URL path you need to do the download. And then it also includes functionality for getting through those files, parsing the JSON, and accessing the bits of content that are most relevant to the specific research question. There was a programming historian lesson that came out, probably 2 years ago now, that dives into usage of the feature reader, the extracted features files, and then also explains how to use a Python library called Pandas that isn't part of the extracted features library. So the extracted features library relies on this other third-party library called Pandas. And this programming historian lesson is really nice because you get a feel for the extracted features data set, which is HTRC specific, and the feature reader library, which is also very specific to the Research Center, which then you can also learn about Pandas, which is a commonly used tool within the data science community. All right, so the final conceptual area that we're going to look at is this idea of non-consumptive research. So non-consumptive research is a concept that basically says that it is permissible to allow machines to read text, which might otherwise be limited by copyright, so long as the materials are not presented to a human reader for the use of understanding the content as a human reader. So it's okay for machines to crunch the text as data, but it's not okay to present the materials for the human reader to sit and read for pleasure or for study. This comes out of a court case from almost 10 years ago now. And it's really the foundation of the HTRC's work. So sometimes people come to the Research Center and they are curious why they can't download content in the way they would imagine you might be able to, or why is there that model for not being able to see the underlying data with the algorithms? And this idea of non-consumptive research is the reason why. other term that you might hear is called non-expressive use. All right, so practically, non-consumptive research covers tasks like the ones that are listed on this slide. So things like text extraction, linguistic analysis, text analysis, OCR correction, indexing, and search. You'll see it doesn't include things like, sitting down and reading. Where the idea of non-consumptive research comes into play most vividly for a researcher is within the data capsules environment. So this is the Capsule Model. If you can think way back to that triangle where we're thinking about data that is provided in a more, in a less restricted format, but where the access and the outputs are controlled. So the capsules, while they might sound like something that is like very tool-based or interface heavy, they're really just a Linux virtual desktop running on a computer at Indiana University with certain security settings that a researcher can remote log into. So if you've ever used something like remote desktop to connect to another Windows machine, or forget what the utility on a Mac is called, but that's essentially what's happening here. You're just remote connecting to another desktop. So on the slide, you're seeing a window within my desktop on my Mac that is the desktop of this Linux virtual machine. And they have protocols for data import and export. Each of the capsules comes with pre-installed tools. So some of them are HTRC developed, some of them are more general. The idea here is that we don't want every researcher to have to reinstall the same tool set. So we try to start researchers out with tools that they think they'll want to use. There are two types of data capsules. There's the demo capsule and the research capsule. Demo capsules provide the least amount of computational resource, and they don't allow a researcher to export results. They only have access to the public domain data, but they also don't require any additional information to create. You just click the button, click another button, and then you have your capsule. There are also research capsules. And to create a research capsule, you have a little bit more opportunities to provide details about the customization of the machine, so up to 16 gigabytes of memory and up to four virtual CPUs. And then we let the researcher choose what they need within those resource allocations. They can have access to the in-copyright data, but the process for that happens by application. So to create one of these research capsules, the researcher tells us a little bit about themselves, what their research question is, what their methods are, how they plan to use the results of their study. And if they go through that process and they don't check the box that says, yes, I would like to analyze the in-copyright data, then their capsule is created and we have that information about them stored in our system. If they do check the box that says, yes, I would like to include that in-copyright data, access to that in-copyright data in my capsule, then they have to provide some justification for why their research need warrants that usage. And then that request is approved by someone on our staff. And those capsules with that in-copyright access for text and data mining is only available to researchers from member institutions. So not because they get some kind of special superior copyright privileges legally. That's not the case. It's just that our resources are limited, so we provide that as a benefit to the member researchers from member institutions. We went through all of those. Okay, so here's this case of how someone used a data capsule. So this isn't a research example so much as it is a classroom example. The visualization librarian at Georgia Tech last spring, I think it was last spring. Yes, it was 2018. Last spring, she worked with this undergraduate class. I think they were in English class. So the students created volume lists, or we helped them create these volume lists of magazines from the turn of the 20th century. And then the students visualized and analyzed the data using the tool called Voyant. So Voyant is a pretty common text analysis tool in digital humanities. These students weren't quite ready to do a programming project on their own, but they also wanted the benefit of the visualization tools and some of the capabilities of Voyant that aren't a part of the analytics algorithms, those off-the-shelf ones from HTRC. So the Capsule environment was perfect for them. They could run Voyant from the desktop, it's installed there, and then they were able to export some keywords and context from their data analysis. All right, I'm going to run through other services from HathiTrust and the Research Center, and then I'll leave plenty of time at the end for questions. So some researchers will get to this point in hearing about the Research Center and they'll say, yeah, but I just want to download some files locally and I only need public domain files. What are my options? So there is the possibility of doing a custom dataset request. And these are for researchers who need access to public domain content only. So we don't allow people to download that in copyright data. They're, of course, downloadable to a person's personal machine, and they include OCR and metadata. There is a REST request procedure where you have to just describe your research and what you're intending to do with the data set. And there is a limitation based on Google digitization. So if a researcher at your institution wants access to public domain files that were digitized by Google, then someone at your institution has to sign an agreement that is a blanket agreement that covers anyone who would come in the future and want to download some of that content as well. We have a wiki that's at wiki.htrc.illinois.edu, which is all of our documentation. And it includes further information about all of the tools that I described, technical documentation about some information about how they're built, and then also step-by-step guides and tutorials with screenshots walking you through how to use each of them, and describing how a researcher would go through the process of engaging with the Research Center. We also hold office hours every third Wednesday of the month from 3 to 4 p.m. So this is a chance to come, ask questions, connect with other researchers if they happen to be in attendance. The link to connect to the office hours is on the slide. It's go.illinois.edu/HTRC-help-live. And they're pretty free form right now. So come with a question. It's a Zoom call. People come with their camera on or off, and we just sort of have a conversation for the month. It can be a good time to hear about the kinds of projects other people are working on. And we're always happy to connect with people during that time. We also keep a help email address, which is htrc-help@hathitrust.org for general inquiries, troubleshooting, and research consultations. So some people, they come across a bug and they want to report it. That's how you use this email address. Some people want to just ask an email question. They don't want to come to office hours, or they want to schedule a one-on-one consultation outside of office hours. That is a service that we provide to researchers. So if you contact us, ask us for help with your specific question or need, then we will schedule a time to hop on a video or a phone call and go through the specifics with you about how to best approach the question that you're trying to answer. And sometimes the answer to the question is, we don't have the data to support your research question, or I think there's a better tool that would suit your research need. So really trying to help people figure out what would best suit the project that they're trying to pursue. I had mentioned earlier that we help build data sets, so we can help a researcher in crafting a list of volume IDs. There's 2 split pathways for this right now, although it should be getting more streamlined in the future. So if you want to request a custom data set from HathiTrust, you can use the feedback@issues.hathitrust.org email address, or if you need help creating an HTRC work set, then you would contact htrc-help@hathitrust.org. Although if you wrote to one or the other, we can route you to the right place. We also have a program called Advanced Collaborative Support, and these are competitively awarded grants in time and resources, not in money, that help researchers pursue a project that they wouldn't otherwise be able to accomplish without a little bit of extra support. So sometimes that means they need access to high-performance computing and our data in a way that they wouldn't be able to do independently, or they need assistance from some of our research programmers figuring out how to get the tools that they want to use to do what they want them to do. And so these projects run for about 6 months to a year at a time. We've done 4 rounds now. And then next awardees for this next cycle will be announced soon. And then we'll probably do our next call in the spring. You can read the reports from each of those projects on the wiki. This link is sort of indecipherable, I know, with the string of letters at the end, but these are also linked off the homepage of the wiki. And reading through these research examples is also a good way of understanding what kinds of research are possible using the Research Center, and to get an idea of how someone engaged with the data that we provide access to. So one example of a ACS project that happened 2 cycles ago is a project from Dan Batchu, who's now at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And he's an architectural historian, and he was interested in finding instances of the term Chicago School across the HathiTrust corpus, and then linking them to Wikipedia entries using this tool called the Wikifier. So, you know, there's a bit of natural language processing that has to happen to identify all of these Chicago schools. And then the Wikifier tool does the magic of identifying which of the specific Chicago schools was being referenced and then pointing to the correct Wikipedia entry. He found that there are many different types of Chicago schools. So he probably knew this, but this was new to me. So one example I liked in particular was the Chicago School of Boners, but there was also, you know, the Chicago School of, you know, well-behaved young women, or the Chicago, you know, the South Chicago School, things like that. So he had to disambiguate them using the Wikifier tool. We found as he started to experiment that if he had processed the data using the Wikifier in an HTRC data capsule, it would have taken years to complete the process of running because of the amount of space that's available to someone in a research capsule and just the sheer computational load of this Wikifier tool. So that's where an ACS project in particular comes in handy. The capsule, you know, they can do quite a bit, but they can only do so much. So our research programmer was able to rewrite some of the code he was using and make the process run in parallel, high performance computers at IU, and then it could complete in a matter of, I think, a week, as opposed to years. Okay, so that's all I have. Looks like we have about 10 minutes for questions. So I'm happy to answer anything that came up or go back to anything that was confusing. I know I moved quickly over a lot of content.
Okay. Thank you. Let's see if anybody has questions.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
A little bit.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. You know, all these research center tools would be using data from the HathiTrust collections, right? Yes. So, say a researcher has a set of data, you know, that he or she has collected over the years. Would the researcher be able to use some of the tools to analyze, to do some research, and not using HathiTrust data?
Not using off-the-shelf tools, but using either the extracted features data set, if you can make the 2 sets of data fit together in that way, or in a data capsule, you can do that kind of comparative work. So we had a researcher at Northeastern University who had collected scans of materials in archives. She was a social scientist studying women's history. So she'd done a lot of scanning and then some of her own OCRing. And she was able to explore using this other data set that she had, you know, really handcrafted, you know, gone through this process against some of the data that was in the digital library. So that's the benefit of the capsule. Also, you can bring in any of your own data that you want to analyze. You just have to be prepared to run whichever tool that you want to run on it. So it's meant for researchers who have a data set and aren't prepared to do that sort of programming and text analysis independently.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, we're always available if anything comes up later on. Happy to answer questions if they arise for you in the coming weeks or months.
Yeah. So I know, Eleanor, when we spoke about a particular use case, but you went into more detail about if there is in copyright data, essentially what would be exportable or usable.
Yes, yeah. So out of the data capsules?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there's a process for reviewing the data that's coming out of a capsule. So a researcher who wants to export their results, they submit a request, and then there's a human review process to open the files and look at them and to assess whether they are in compliance with our policy. And the kinds of things that you can export are primarily derived data. So, a topic model is a good example. That would be a list of terms or concepts. You can also export images of results, so long as it's not images of the page or a screenshot of the page or the full text. And you can also export things like keywords and context. So if there are specific terms that you are studying, then you can pull out that term with the words that exist around it, so long as it's not like the word "the" and 10 words on either side, because then we're sort of quickly getting at the entire work. So there's a process of assessing the scope and the scale of the data that's being requested to be taken out. There's also if you were interested in exporting sort of like numerical analyses, so word frequency trends, things like that, you can also do that. Or if there were other like data that was existing in some kind of table, so long as the export of the material didn't appear as purchased the work, then that generally is within the lines of our policy.
And you'd mentioned early on that with member institutions, we would have access to both public domain and so like a CC license.
Yeah, so anyone who creates an account has access to analyze the in-copyright data using the off-the-shelf algorithms. And then anyone in the public has the ability to do that with the Bookworm Tool or the extracted features dataset. The membership of HathiTrust has the benefit of being able to request a data capsule that includes access to the in-copyright data. And that happens through a request process. So one thing we're checking in the request is whether or not the researcher is from a member institution. And then we're also checking to see whether or not the project that they have described sounds like a legitimate text analysis project. That's sort of the basic standard for looking at one of those requests.
I don't have questions. It's good information. It's just absorbing it all.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. It was very useful.
Thank you for having me come and virtually present. I'm happy to stay in touch as you all move forward if there's anything that comes up.
Okay. And are you available to do other presentations in the future?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
All part of my job. Yeah. Have a good afternoon.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.